Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's high time to start. Thank you very much for coming here. Our today's meeting will be devoted to a presentation and afterwards discussion on the book Leadership Decapitation, Strategic Targeting of Terrorist Organizations. And I'm very glad to introduce our special guest today, Dr. Jenna Jordan, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs at Georgia Institute of Technology. And before moving to the presentation itself, I would like to give the floor to our program manager, who is responsible for projects in Middle East and North Africa, Ruslan Mamedov.
Thank you. It's good. Yeah. Thank you, Elena. So practically, yeah, we have a very interesting discussion. I think we'll have today, and first we'll have a presentation. Practically, we will talk about a number of terrorist organizations. And before starting this event, I would like to mention that most of them are designated as terrorist organizations in the Russian Federation and by the UN Security Council. This is something which is important. And starting from, I would like to, to mention that the book and the presentation, the book of Dr. Jordan about leadership decapitation is becoming more and more significant. If we look at the developments which are happening today in the Middle East, and not only in the Middle East, but broadly, but mostly we will talk maybe about the organizations which are working in the Middle East, and we'll discuss these organizations. We'll discuss the resilience of these structures, even though there could be some process of decapitation in these U.S. policies. We'll discuss counterterrorism and how it's connected to the maybe we would like to listen it also counterterrorism and its relations to the international law, to the statehood capacities, etc. So this is something that is important. Maybe there will be questions about the external actors and their destructive or positive policies through all over the globe in doing this counterterrorism activities. So practically we could start from here. So please, Dr. Jordan, would like to listen about the U.S. approaches towards how to deal with the terrorist organizations. And yes, floor is yours.
Do I need a microphone, or can everyone hear me okay? Maybe I better. Is that on? Yeah, that's on. Okay. Is that good? Yes. All right. So thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting to be here talking about my book project. So thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here. So I'm just gonna, I want to make a couple things, just want to clarify a couple issues up front. So this is the book, Leadership Decapitation. Decapitation does not refer to, it is a figurative term, and I use it to mean the arresting or killing of terrorist leaders. And I'm not just talking about top leaders, I'm talking about leaders that could also be considered members of the upper echelon of an organization. So kind of the leadership, but not only the top leaders of organizations. And I'll say more about that later on in the talk. So additionally, the findings of this book are based on a data set that I put together that I'll also talk a little bit more about. But basically, it's about I'm looking at about 1,000 cases of leadership targeting from 1970 to 2016. And then in some of the cases, a little bit later as well. And I'll talk about that more. But this includes instances of leadership targeting around the globe. So it's not just targeting carried out by the US government. It's targeting carried out against terrorist leaders in Israel, in Sri Lanka, Tamil separatists, right? I mean, South America, Western Europe, right? So it's really a broad take. And then in the book, I go into a little bit of detail, not a little bit of detail, but I have some more cases where I look more in depth at Hamas. I look at Shining Path, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I look at Al-Qaeda. So we can talk more about those as the talk goes on. And as I'm speaking, if there's anything that's unclear, please feel free to interrupt me. This is a small group. We can make this a nice discussion style, you know. So without further ado, is there a clicker? Okay, great. Thank you. So here we have Osama bin Laden. He was the leader of Al-Qaeda, killed in a raid on May 2nd, 2011 in Abbottabad, Pakistan. This is Anwar al-Awlaki. He was an American. He was a senior leader, and he was a recruiter for Al-Qaeda. And he was killed on September 30th, 2011 by a U.S. drone strike in Yemen. This is Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he was killed June in 2006 by a U.S. airstrike in Iraq. Here we have two leaders. These were the founders and spiritual and more operational leaders of Hamas. So here we have Abdulaziz al-Rantisi. This is Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He was more of a spiritual leader. TC had more of an operational role. And they were killed both in 2004 by Hellfire missiles fired from Israeli Apache helicopters in Gaza City. Here we have Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, and he was a senior leader of ISIS. He was a spokesperson. Pardon?
PR, yeah. Guy in charge of PR.
Yeah, exactly. He was he sort of oversaw recruitment of foreign fighters as well, sort of outreach activities, and he was killed by a drone strike in Aleppo, Syria, in 2016. Here we have Abimel Guzman. So he was the leader of an organization called Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, which was a organization in Peru. He was captured in September 1992 in Lima by Peruvian authorities. Now, interestingly, pictures like this of him in a tiger cage in this striped attire were widely broadcasted, right? And this was seen as a humiliating and demoralizing blow to Guzman and to the organization broadly. And his death is often seen as like a really successful case of decapitation, where his death brought about, arrest rather, brought about the beginning of the demise of the organization. However, the group continued to carry out activity, and leadership was assumed by another man. And so this is beginning of what made me sort of start questioning some of the assumptions about leadership targeting. Here we have Abdullah Öcalan, another very well-known figure in the decapitation world. He was leader of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and he was arrested in Kenya in 1999. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and there was a considerable decline in PKK's activity following his arrest. But his followers continued their campaign, and this was in spite of his sort of calls for his followers to renounce their violence. And as we know, the PKK is now, currently quite active again today. And then finally, we have Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leader of ISIS, right, that we all know, killed in a raid on October 27th in Syria. And actually, interestingly, my book came out like 2 days before he was killed, which was really, crazy timing. Good timing for the book. Okay. I know, it's a dark topic, so you have to make it light when you can. Okay, so this is basically a chart that shows trends in leadership targeting over time from 1970 to 2016. And it's kind of hard to see on this, I apologize, but the blue are arrests and the red are killing of leaders. So targeting, and this is now focusing on the U.S. perspective. So in the 2006 National Strategy for Combating Terrorism, targeting leaders was listed first as the main priority of action, right? It was a central, and it has been, and it continues to be a central feature in U.S. counterterrorism policy. And the 2011 document that then came out focused less on sort of strategies of regime change, right, that you saw the U.S. engage in 2003 and the invasion of Iraq following 9/11, and sort of emphasized more the importance of undermining Al-Qaeda's operational capacity. And it presented a really a sort of broader approach toward eliminating the threat of terrorism through weakening, disrupting, degrading Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Now, the 2011 document doesn't highlight the tactical choices necessary to achieve its broader goals. And I think that's in part due to some of the challenges that the U.S. was facing in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time. But it argues that U.S. efforts in Afghanistan and and Pakistan had, all the drone strikes that the U.S. was carrying out in the federally administered tribal areas, had destroyed much of the organization's leadership and had substantially weakened the organization. Now, this document was released just after the death of bin Laden in 2011 and claimed that the group was now struggling, facing significant organizational challenges. Now, the most recent document goes back and says we should be killing leaders and lists it as a priority of action. So that's where we are kind of now with U.S. counterterrorism policy. So this is decapitation attempts specifically against Al-Qaeda from 1995 to 2016, and you can see it's broken out by affiliate. You've got Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, which has now been renamed, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Shabaab, newer affiliates in South Asia. And so, and then this is a chart that shows Al-Qaeda attacks, and I apologize here, the colors on the slides are not really great, but you can see, interestingly, right, even with a huge increase in targeting efforts around, starting in 2010, 2011, 2012, you also see a big incline in activity. Now, obviously, I'm not saying there's direct causal relationship, but it is interesting, right, that these counterterrorism documents have said how successful these efforts have been in degrading the operational capacity of an organization, yet we see affiliates that are incredibly active, right? Okay, so basically this brings me to sort of, what do I want to understand in this project, right? Why am I looking at all this? And what I really want to understand is why some groups persist and other groups collapse. When is leadership decapitation effective? And when is it not, right? Because sometimes it does work. Sometimes it does bring about a group's demise or its substantial weakening. And then why, right? What is it about certain organizations that makes them more or less likely? So that's the question I'm answering in this particular book. So basically, to account for variation in the efficacy of leadership targeting, and I'll talk about efficacy in a little bit because that's kind of a big, broader challenge, I argue that it's basically due to three factors: organizational structure, popular support, and group type or ideology. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So let's start with bureaucracy. Okay, so that's all I've got on this slide. So I prefer fewer slides and more words spoken. Okay. So bureaucracy, which it sounds, I think, sort of like an odd term when you're thinking about a terrorist organization, right? We think about bureaucracies as being businesses and things like that, but you could almost think of a terrorist organization like a firm in some ways, and which is what I did when I first started on this project. So I thought, well, structure, I think, is important. So basically, bureaucratization, we can think about it as an internal mechanism, one that increases a group's stability and facilitates a succession process, right, whereby leadership might come out, but you know who's going to step in next. And bureaucratized terrorist groups are diversified. They have a clear division of administrative responsibilities and functions. They have organizational redundancy, standard operating procedures, rules, routines, right? Things that minimize organizational disruption. And a point that I think is interesting is that bureaucracies tend to be seen as efficient, right? We could think about bureaucracies as being efficient, although, just put kind of as an aside, there's also a huge body of literature about the pathologies of bureaucracies, and I'm sure, right, all of us have experienced the challenges of dealing with bureaucracies in our lives. Yeah. Universities are notorious for, however, right, there is an efficiency to bureaucracies, right? There is an efficient component to it. And what's interesting is that they're often seen as more legitimate in the eyes of local communities. And this becomes an important point when you're thinking about terrorist organizations. Routines, right? Bureaucracies have routines, and they're seen as the primary means by which groups can accomplish much of what they do, right? These groups become seen as reliable and accountable and more able to resist destabilization, but also to adapt and evolve. One thing that's actually interesting is Al-Qaeda in Iraq is a great example of this. So after the, excuse me, after the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, right, the U.S. captured a huge amount of documents of Al-Qaeda, AQI. And basically, these documents painted a picture of like a highly bureaucratized organization, right? They had rosters of members and what they were paid and their duties and their responsibilities, and individuals had to submit, regular memos to the leadership, right, letting them know what they. It was really fascinating to see this picture of this group that was so bureaucratized. It was, and actually, you can go online. There's they're all online. There's the Harmony program, it's called, and I think it's online through the State Department, but you can go and just see all these documents, and many of them are translated into English, and it's really fascinating to read them. You can read letters between bin Laden and Zawahiri and what they were saying to each other about some of the organizational dynamics and tactics, so it's quite fascinating. The final point I want to make here is that groups that tend to be, we often think about decentralization as being something that makes groups harder to defeat, right? This sort of network structured of organizations. But what I found is groups that are bureaucratized at the upper levels of the administration and decentralized at a lower operational level, it's these organizations that are very hard to defeat. So Hamas was a great example of a group like that. Okay, the next factor is communal support or local support. Terrorist organizations need support from their communities to get resources that they need to operate and survive. Local support allows groups to replenish their membership, which is like the main thing terrorist organizations need, right? What do they need more than anything? They need people. They need money, they need resources, and they need the ability to operate covertly. And so local communities can help groups do that. I mean, thinking at even like a basic level, right? Terrorists need safe houses, right? They need places to hide. Maybe they need connections to criminal networks, right? Maybe they need fake passports, right? Things like that. I mean, at a really basic operational level, and communities help organizations do this. They can help avoid detection, surveillance. And another interesting point here is that, the beliefs of the community matter as well. So support for violence, right, from their local communities can encourage groups to carry out more violent campaigns. And societies where you see really heavy-handed counterterrorism tactics carried out by the state, those local communities tend to have a higher tolerance for violence, right? And then you see this kind of, reinforcing dynamic where you've got this social tolerance for violence and groups' willingness to be more violent because it's reflecting the beliefs of the communities from which they emerge. And so it's this really interesting dynamic. Now, if groups have a lot of popular support, what might we see, right? Well, we might see things like local infrastructure, right? Groups setting up infrastructure to hand out, basic social services, education. And interestingly, we were talking just prior about weak states, right? This is a great opportunity for terrorist groups, right? When states are weak or they're unable to provide for their people, right? You could think about this in the case of, the Israeli government, not in terms of weakness, but in terms of lack of provision of services for, Palestinians, right? Hamas came in and filled a really much needed gap there. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, right? In Yemen, they were providing all kinds of services. So it's really fascinating. And so you might see infrastructure, right? That might be an indicator of support in some way. Societal tolerance for violence, as I mentioned. The existence of really heavy-handed counterterrorism policies, right? Things like, this was, a big argument in sort of the early days in the aftermath of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, that, you had all this sentiment, all this support for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? Because they were fighting the U.S. occupation. And then, what happened with Al-Qaeda in Iraq? Well, they became what we now know of as ISIS, And public opinion polls, obviously, are a place to look at, which is one of the things that I looked at in the book as well. The final factor I want to talk about is ideology. So for this project, I classified groups along different categories, as religious, as separatist, as Islamist, as left-wing or right-wing, and they're not, there can be overlap, right? So you can have a group that's religious and Islamist, or separatist and religious, right? So it allows for overlap to get at that. Now, separatist groups and religious groups are often fighting for causes that resonate from their local communities. I think that's really clear in the case of separatist groups, right? They're often advocating for a community's independence or autonomy or basic rights or representation. And research has found that ideological motivation, right, whether groups are nationalist or religious, is a really important condition in understanding civilian support for terrorist groups. Now, religious groups may not represent the views of an entire community, right? I think we can see, and I think it seems to make more sense that terrorist groups, separatist groups would have more of that. So religious groups might not represent the views of the entire community, but they are likely to represent a considerable portion of them. And so this support should provide the organization with access to resources, right? Going back to what I was talking about communal support. Now, there's a number of factors that can account for why some groups are more likely to be supported by their communities, right? Groups often seek territorial control, right? In part to acquire or increase their community support. Now, there obviously might be a preference divergence between the terrorist group and communities in terms of toleration for violence, right? I think that's a big issue to consider. However, there should be sort of fewer social mores against joining a violent movement in pursuit of these goals. And this is a really important point, and I wasn't going to get much into this today, but I think it's something really interesting to think about, and we can talk about it more if people are interested. It's kind of trying to understand why you get individuals to join a terrorist organization, right? How do you, it's a high bar to entry, right? You have to break social mores, you have to basically be willing to kill civilians, right? We're all conditioned in society, not to kill other people. There's obviously a sort of collective action problem in that you've got an organization that's operating on behalf of maybe your community beliefs, and you think, well, let them handle it, right? So how do you get people to participate? Well, there's arguments about selective incentives and things like this, but this ideological motivator can be a powerful mechanism. And groups know this, right? So they use rhetoric in order to kind of challenge those deeply entrenched social mores that would prohibit people or dissuade people from joining movements. Okay, so the point, though, here about religious and separatist organizations, right, my expectation that you would be more likely to see those groups as being more resilient to targeting has to do with doctrine, right, and the reproduction of it. So as I mentioned, right, separatist groups and religious groups or terrorist groups are often representative of views in the community which they emerge. So because of that, the doctrine exists beyond the leader itself, right? The leader isn't necessary in every case for the articulation or re-articulation of the doctrine. And I think that's a really important point. So bin Laden, for instance, right, he made a really concerted effort to broaden the appeal of Al-Qaeda's ideological message. And in fact, you saw lots of shifts over time in Al-Qaeda's message, right? It shifted from focusing initially on the Israeli-Palestinian, well, not initially, but at one iteration on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? And then focusing on the West, and then focusing on the U.S., and then focusing on a sort of, Salafist jihad type of orientation. And so broadening that appeal was really important, and through messaging efforts, right? So Adnani, who we saw a picture of earlier, right? Adnani had stated, he was the ISIS kind of spokesperson. He had stated that even if, the U.S. continues, and U.S. international forces as well, right, continue taking away our territory, which they successfully have done a lot of, right? It doesn't matter because our ideology will remain, right? We can retreat into the desert and we can still exist and we can regroup and reorganize ourselves. And Adnani, I wish I had the exact quote. It was actually quite interesting how he said it. So the key point here was that religious groups and separatist groups should be more resistant to counterterrorism efforts because they're not dependent always, right, of course there's exceptions, we're dealing with statistics, so there's always exceptions, upon their leadership for their ideological coherence. Now, this is in contrast to like left and right-wing organizations, where, you know, they're often sort of, you know, led by particular leaders that have a very specific take on an ideological doctrine. So thinking about the Shining Path in Peru, right? Guzman had a very particular sort of interpretation of Marxism that was kind of necessary. It depended upon him, right, to kind of continue its message. It wasn't, you know, a sort of standard take. He kind of took from different philosophers and kind of came up with his own sort of orientation. And so that's kind of an example of that. Or many of the, you know, organizations that were active in Western Europe in the 60s and 70s, right, had a very unique kind of ideological belief. And you know, so we can talk more about some of those particular issues as well if people are interested. So, well, how did I look at all this? So I put together a model. I collected all this data, right? You know, about 1,000 instances of leadership targeting, and I looked at a bunch of different sort of variables. And to take it back to the theory that I was just talking about, what I had sort of assumed was that age and size might be good proxies for bureaucracy. And the intuition is that as an organization grows in age, or I'm sorry, grows in size and gets older, they're more likely to develop bureaucratic structures. And part of this was taken actually from research I did by just looking at business management literature, right? And which was, you know, not my most favorite body of literature I've ever read. However, I found it really instructive because it made really interesting arguments about why a group, as it grows, develop bureaucratic structures, right? It's just easier to manage itself in some way. And then they also talk about the resilience of older and larger organizations. Religious type, or group type rather, which I talked about. I looked at whether the leader was a top leader or a member of the upper echelon, whether they were arrested or killed. And then I looked at a couple different sort of control variables. I looked at GDP, population, and regime type to try to get at this idea of state capacity. And these were, I talked myself in circles on these, right? Because you could make an argument for why an authoritarian regime might be more, an organization coming from a state that was more authoritarian might be more resilient. But you could also, I can kind of make the same argument for why it might be less resilient because it's already experiencing some maybe more heavy-handed tactics, right? But then you get it to, you know, capacity, and maybe democracies are more willing to carry out really heavy-handed counterterrorism tactics. And this actually gets to a question for my next project that I'll kind of end with saying a few words on. So those questions I'm not totally sure on. That's what I'm sort of hoping to do a little more research on. So then I had to think about, well, how do we measure the efficacy of this strategy, right? How do you determine whether or not it, sorry, which page am I on? 1 second here. Here we go. How do you determine whether or not it works, right? Or how do you determine what counts as working? And so I looked at a few different measures. I looked at organizational activity, right? Whether or not a group just carries out activity. I looked at the frequency with which it was carrying out attacks. And then I looked at its survival rate. So basically it's like death rate, right? It's sort of the hazard rate. And so for organizational activity, I looked at it in a few different bins. I looked at 1 year, 2 year, and 5 year periods of activity after an instance of decapitation, right? Whether a group carried out some activity or no activity. Attack frequency was gauging whether it sort of looked prior to and post attacks to whether you see an increasing rate of attacks or a decreasing rate of attacks. And then finally, survival rate, I compared the rate of groups that hadn't been targeted and groups that hadn't been targeted to see if overall, on average, it's an effective strategy, right? Okay, and so what I found was that sort of on average, right, overall, really larger groups, Islamist groups, and separatist groups were the strongest, right? Those were the most significant predictors of whether or not decapitation was going to have an effect. And what I found was that those groups are very resilient, right? I also found that older groups, in some cases, were more likely to continue carrying out activity after having their leaders targeted, but it was a less consistent finding, and it wasn't significant in all of the models that I created. I also found that against the most active organization, decapitation actually results in an increase in activity. So some of the organizations that were carrying out the most terrorist attacks, you saw an increase in activity after decapitation. I also found that organizations in more autocratic countries and those that had a higher GDP also had a higher rate of decline, which I thought was an interesting finding. And so overall, right, it doesn't seem to shorten a group's lifespan, decrease its activity or its lethality, or bring about a demise of terrorist activity. And that's most true for these certain kinds of organizations, right? Religious groups, Islamist groups, separatist groups, and larger groups. Now, I also looked at attack frequency, and I did a transition matrix analysis, basically. And what I showed was that decapitated groups have a higher probability of increasing attacks than non-decapitated groups, right? Indicating that overall, sort of on par, I think we could think of it as a counterproductive strategy. But the probability of that happening depended largely on prior level of activity. So if a group was already increasing in attacks, you're going to see an increase. Now, the final thing was survival, and this was an interesting one for me. So there's other people that have done work on decapitation, and we disagree, right, as all academics do. We all have different findings, and part of the reason why is that we have different data, right? We're looking at different time periods. We have different criteria for inclusion in our data sets and things like that. But one thing is that there's a guy named Brian Price that works on this. He's a wonderful person. He's really, really nice, so I'm not trying to, but he finds that decapitation decreases the survival rate of an organization, right? So it makes it more likely to die over time. What I found was that there was no statistically significant relationship. Groups that were targeted and groups that were not targeted did not have a significant, groups that were targeted did not have a significantly higher chance of falling apart over time. And actually, what I found was that those groups that I mentioned, right, separatist groups, Islamist groups, religious groups, actually had a higher rate of survival over time. Okay, so, that's the curve here. So these are just some charts, but let's not go into that. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the counterproductive consequences of targeting. So as I mentioned, right, the data shows that we're seeing an increase in activity, right? We're not seeing a decline in activity for the kinds of organizations that, quite frankly, like the US and most other countries are targeting right now, right? Islamist groups, religious groups, separatist groups, large groups that have been around for a long time now.
One group being the Islamist, religious, and separatist. Why do you divide?
Why do I divide? Because some groups we can just consider, so for instance,
religious and Islamist. Why we do?
Because some groups aren't, there's if you think back in history, right, there was Jewish Jewish terrorist organizations that were fighting against the British and the establishment of the state, right? So they're, the LTTE, for instance, right, they were Hindu. So there are other religions that are in the data set as well.
So we just want to, just withdraw Islamist groups from those others.
I did pull those. Yes, that's the only one I did that for, and part of the reason was because of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and many of the major efforts at counterterrorism policies now. And another reason I actually did that was interesting. There's a body. This is just an aside, and it's a really good point. There's a body of literature in the terrorism literature that says, well, so many of the Islamist groups have been more prolific in their attacks, right? They've been carrying out more attacks. And why is that? So they found this statistical finding that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are carrying out more deadly attacks and more frequent attacks. And so why is that? So just kind of to engage with that body of literature, I pulled this variable out and analyzed it separately. Yeah. I actually used to, well, I don't need to go, how do I get this? That's two in the weeds, Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the counterproductive consequences. So why might you see an increase in attacks, right? Why might you see groups sort of, I mean, I don't think we can say that they're strengthening, but that they're able to withstand efforts, right? I think part of it has to do with this idea of revenge, right? When leaders are killed, people, obviously the organizations aren't happy about it, but in many cases, the local communities aren't as well, right? Particularly for groups that are representing the views of people that feel like the group is fighting for their cause. And this revenge motivator can sort of call upon, can inspire groups to call for retaliatory attacks. An example of this might be, just one that actually pops in my head is, there was a bomb maker, who was sort of a leader bomb maker for Islamic Jihad named Yahya Ayash, and he was killed, and the organization called for the group to carry out, or called for individuals affiliated with the group or not to carry out attacks to avenge his death. And indeed there was a very violent suicide attack just after, directly attributed to his death. So that revenge is a very strong motivator, as we all know, right? I mean, people are not really sad when these terrorist leaders are killed, right? I mean, when your state is the victim of an attack, people want revenge, right? They want the leaders to be held accountable. I mean, I remember in the United States after bin Laden was killed, people were outside the White House cheering, right? I mean, this sense of revenge is a very powerful motivator for people, and that's on both sides. And in fact, there's some interesting studies done by some Israeli scholars, right? Because they've obviously looked at this issue for a long time, given that the Israelis have been targeting, leaders in Palestinian militant organizations since the 80s. Actually, they started in the 80s and then started killing in 93, which was just an interesting shift. So many of those scholars have said, well, you know what, this isn't the most effective strategy, but we need to keep doing it. And part of the reason why is that it makes publics feel secure, right? It makes you feel like your country is fighting a good cause, is keeping you safe. And if you think about it, right, you can think about counterterrorism policies as being observable and unobservable, right? And there's lots of unobservable policies that our states are doing all the time that are keeping us safe that we can't see, right? Think about intelligence and things that are happening, right, that are sort of, protecting the homeland. But we don't see those things, right? Whereas these are really visible, and it makes publics feel safe, right? It makes people feel like our state is fighting terrorism. And so I think that's something really important to keep in mind, right? Why it is, people always ask, well, if this doesn't work, why do we keep doing it? Well, I think that's one very convincing, compelling reason. Okay. In other cases, right, the retaliation, you can also get this sense of this idea that sympathy for the cause can cause recruitment, right? And we see this now with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in lots of cases, right? You've got people that go online and they're being, they're sort of feeling sympathetic for a particular organization. And I think this is actually sort of bolstered by really heavy-handed counterterrorism strategies like occupation, for instance. And so people go online, right? They're radicalized. I mean, this is where a lot of this radicalization is happening now, right, in Telegram and these encrypted platforms. And groups are very adept at taking advantage of this sentiment, Actually, I have a friend that studies some of the uses of social media by ISIS, and she does all this work in the chat rooms, and it's like terrifying and really interesting. Okay, radicalization. Another important thing to think about in terms of the adverse consequences is this idea of resolve, right? And oftentimes, right, you'll see attacks carried out right after an instance of targeting. And part of the reason is for groups to signal to their adversary that they're still strong, right? And that they haven't been weakened. And that signal, right, that signal of strength is an important motivating factor oftentimes for organizations. Groups can also adapt and learn, as I talked about, right? Bureaucracies sometimes are good. Sometimes they can be good learners, sometimes not. But I think in the case of terrorist organizations, right, you see this adaptive process a lot. And splintering. And I'm going to end with just saying a few words about splintering and then sort of some of the larger policy implications. This is a project I'm hoping to work on next. And oftentimes after an instance of targeting, you'll see a group splinter. And I really want to understand the dynamics of that, right? Do those splinters, are they more radical? Are they less radical, right? Are they more willing to work within the, legitimate processes of the state, right, becoming a political party, or are they way more extreme and more radical? And what causes the splintering, right? What other than things like leadership targeting results in splintering? So that's one issue that I'm hoping to work on for a next project. And now looking at the policy implications. So people ask me all the time, okay, so if this doesn't work, what do we do? Right? What do we do? And then I, have my, flip academic answer. Oh, well, I don't know. I just criticize policies. I can't, I don't know how to fix them. But what I think is really necessary is that we need to actually do a really substantive study of comparing the efficacy of lots of different counterterrorism strategies. So right now I actually have a colleague who's at another school in Georgia with me, and we're sort of conceptualizing counterterrorism policies on a continuum. If anyone has thoughts on this, please share them with me, because we're at the brainstorming kind of theory development stage. But you can think about a continuum from really coercive to really conciliatory policies, right? So things like, foreign-imposed regime change might be on the really highly coercive use of force side, right? Or occupation, right? Military boots on the ground in some way, targeting, and then all the way down on the other end to things like amnesty or truth and reconciliation committees, negotiations, right? And then things in between. And so we're trying to figure out how to think about counterterrorism policies on that strategy, because you need to really compare the efficacy, right? People used to say, well, regime change is the way to go, right? Democratization is going to, keep the world safer. Well, as we saw with many efforts at regime change, not always so effective, right? So really trying to get at that question is something that I'm hoping to do next. So I was going to say a little bit about ISIS, but I feel like perhaps I've talked enough. And if we want to ask about ISIS, we can maybe bring that up in the Q&A. Let me just see if there was one thing I wanted to. Yeah, we can. I'm happy to talk about ISIS in the Q&A, because I think this is a really interesting. Or even people have asked recently about the implications for with Soleimani's death and what that might mean. It's a totally different kind of situation, but there are some interesting implications that we can draw from this. So thank you for listening. I hope that wasn't too tedious. And I look forward to your comments and questions.
Yes, can you just switch off the...
Oh,
sure. Thank you. Yes, thank you for this brilliant presentation. I think we had a number of issues raised, and as a moderator today, I would like to start with my own question, if I can.
Yes.
Yeah, I had two questions in mind, and you already mentioned in the end that we could start with the ISIS or killing of the Qasem Soleimani, which is, as we understand, killing of Qasem Soleimani is something that is new in the U.S. Foreign policies. While if you look at the U.S.'s decision for the last year of designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization in their own laws, so then we clearly see the logic. Yes, well, that's understandable. However, the position of others in the world, I mean, other states, etc. And I remember the Russian position was about that. This is American kind of a aventure or something like that, which will not end well in the end, because we have states, and international law should be somehow there. Yeah. And this is something which is important. But anyway, I mean, we just can keep in mind. But my my research is mostly about Iraq, and that's why I would like to start with the ISIS story. Back then, in 2003 and 2004, it was about Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we had this picture of al-Zarqawi, who is a very important guy in understanding even the ideology of ISIS itself, because for them it's kind of the father of what they are doing, while he was killed in 2006. But anyway, so one factor which is important, I think, and we could talk more about that, is a factor of external or policies of those who are in power. If you take Iraq of 2003, we had the US occupational force in power. We had the new elites coming from abroad to form a new elite in Iraq in the post-Saddam era, and their own policies and what they did. And as far as we understand, and we should bring here the factor of the policy of discrimination of the new elite towards the part of the population, and the support which comes for this new elite from the occupational force which actually had the power on the ground. And I'm here talking about the American military. So practically, both created conditions for rising of the terrorism in this country. If we take, for example, decisions they made, first decisions were made by the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was created by Americans for governing the Iraq. First two decisions was it was the order number 1 of the banning of the Ba'ath Party, which was essential for the state institutions before that, and hundreds of thousands of people they lost their jobs and positions for some time. And the second decision, the order number 2 of the Coalition Provisional Authority was the banning of the army and all other security structures. That was something that contributed to the people just leaving their jobs, leaving their posts, and going to somehow insurgency. And that was the conditions when, as far as I understand, when the terrorist groups, they just, had this into their own, on their own. They tried to use and capitalize on that situation. And if you look at also the social fabric, which is another factor, social fabric of the Iraqi population, and you mentioned about population, but I'd like to go deep, social fabric of the population. If you look at them, then you clearly see the clans in power which were before American invasion, their attitude towards the new authorities, etc., etc., etc. So we have this, track of discrimination, which goes for, then towards radicalization. This creates opportunities for the terrorist groups to rise, and that's what happened in 2003 and 2006. And the only way of how dealing with that is looking at the social fabric. That's what American military did when the General Petraeus started bringing historians, bringing those who are scholars to help him define who are the tribes, who are the leaders of these tribes, and using these tribes to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was the story. But then there was again the problem of the state. So it is not about democratization processes. It's mostly about trying to rebuild the state institutions which were destroyed when Americans invaded Iraq. How and do you include all this when you talk about the policy implications and policy recommendations for the current situation?
Yeah. Wow. Well,
Thank you.
Okay, that is a big question. Fundamentally, I agree with everything that you said and your assessment of the situation in Iraq after 2003. The process of de-Baathification, right, and getting rid of the army and the security forces and like everything, right, and then you have Maliki, discriminating against all of the Sunnis. That set the stage for ISIS in 2014, right, to come through and get all of this support from people who otherwise weren't like really radical in their beliefs, right? Many of the people in the Ba'ath Party were not like super religious, right? But they were felt discriminated against, and so here was an organization that, well, obviously some of their support was coerced, of course, right? But here was an organization that that represented their beliefs, And I think that is what enabled them to make such strides in 2014. Well, I mean, I think that's, you know, pretty obvious. So from this perspective, that's the story that I tell in the book, actually, when I talk about Al-Qaeda. And then I have, in the conclusion, I actually have I wrote it before Baghdadi was killed, but I had a whole thing about ISIS as well. And so I talk about this precisely, and that, to me, really highlights the importance of that local support, right? And that support on the ground, and that's what sort of enabled. And I think you're right. I mean, I like how you talk about the social fabric of the population. That's a nice way to think about it, and I feel that actually probably captures more nuance than I do, to be honest. But I really like that way of thinking about that. So thank you. That's actually really helpful as I sort of move forward. But I think it's exactly right. That's what allows for this process of radicalization that comes from these power vacuums that are created. I mean, this is the argument about the ineffectiveness, the issues with regime change. I actually have there's a book that I just reviewed recently that was written by a woman I went to grad school with, called Covert and Overt Regime Change. I think that's the title of it. And her name's Lindsay O'Rourke, and it's really interesting. And so she actually goes through and looks and tries to explain why states sometimes carry out covert regime change, sometimes it's overt, but looking overall at the efficacy, and largely regime change is not always working for a particular state's national, even like to sort of help advance the state's national interests. So yes, so yes, I totally agree with you. Your first question about Soleimani is a harder one, and this is something I don't look at in the book, and I wish that I did. There's other people that know more about international law and domestic law that write about some of the legal issues of leadership targeting, because there are lots of complicated legal issues, right? Obviously there's laws against the U.S. targeting U.S. citizens without a trial, right? But in the case of Al-Awlaki, for instance, right, they said, well, an attack was imminent, right? I mean, that's, that idea of that imminent attack. And that was the justification for Soleimani, right? The idea that there were imminent attacks that were being planned on 4 U.S. embassies around the world. But one thing that's interesting was the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization in April. Now, as we know, this is not a non-state actor, right? This is, part of the Iranian state. But I remember in April, I thought, oh boy, when that designation happened, I thought this was a likely scenario, because Soleimani has been, right. I mean, then the target of much ire, on the part of the U.S. for a long time. Now, I don't think this means anything for the state of Iran, to be perfectly honest, right. What I found interesting was that right in the aftermath, right, you saw this outpouring of support for Soleimani. And then, and I actually was kind of worried that we were seeing some real dynamics of escalation going on, right? And we were getting higher up the escalation ladder, this sort of tit for tat kind of behavior. And then there was the horrible, shooting down of the airliner, and this kind of de-escalated things, and I think shifted the attention away. But it was really interesting, right? That idea of that rallying around this figure, right, who was, he was, I don't want to say he was a charismatic figure in the way that we talk about terrorist leaders sometimes being charismatic, right, but he was a large force. And, we can think about it organizationally, and I'll get to that in one second, but in terms of that idea of charisma, this is actually something I meant to bring up in the talk, and I didn't. When I first started getting into this, there was this whole argument that in order to understand when leadership targeting works, you have to understand charisma, right? And that terrorist leaders are seen as naturally charismatic in some way. That's how they're able to lead. That's how they're able to get recruits, right? Remember I mentioned earlier this idea of how do you get people to morally disengage such that they're willing to join a terrorist organization and kill other people, right? Well, some of the argument comes from organizational literature that says, well, leaders can provide selective incentives, right? They give people something to join. So, Hamas and Islamic Jihad gave people, money to become suicide bombers, right? They pay their families or take care of them afterwards. That's a material selective incentive. There's also non-material incentives, right? You can join a terrorist organization and gain some kind of sense of community or identity, right? Think about online radicalization. You have all these, isolated individuals who all of a sudden feel part of a particular movement. And so the idea was that the charismatic nature of leaders enabled them to kind of really get at this non-material selective incentive to get people to join an organization. And so, but the problem with this argument is that it's going to overpredict the success of decapitation, right? If all leaders are charismatic, if that's how groups get people, then we should see decapitation always working. But it doesn't always work, right? Lots of times it doesn't work. And so I thought, well, we need something more than charisma, right? We need something more than that. And it's interesting, too, to think about what is charisma, right? Well, have some of us had to read Weber in school, right? And talking about so he talks about, Max Weber was a sociologist, and he talks about, I know this is probably a little boring, but actually it's interesting. He talks about different forms of authority, right? One is charismatic. And so what is charismatic authority? Well, it's something seen as like supernatural, right? Or something godlike, a kind of like deity in some way. There's other forms of authority. There's rational, legal, and then traditional forms of authority. But the charismatic is seen as something as you have this special quality, right? And this goes back to, people often talked about Baghdadi, right, as being this charismatic leader, this cult of personality. And so the point I make is that these explanations are not sufficient, right? Particularly if you're running an ideological organization and you're really good at making that ideology stick beyond you, right? Which I think Baghdadi has done, right? Then that charisma becomes less important. So, but it is in this context, it's important to think about charisma. So back to Soleimani, I don't know if I would say charisma, but he had something around which people, sort of rallied. So it's interesting. The charisma is an interesting point. I mean, I argue against it, but I always fall back on talking about it because it is very fascinating. Actually, yesterday I gave a talk at McGemo, and I got a really interesting question about the difference in charismatic authority if you're talking about charisma for the leader of an Islamist organization versus the charismatic authority of an organization like a left-wing Marxist-Leninist organization that was operating, say, in Western Europe or Latin America in the 60s and 70s. And they get their authority from different things. And so maybe there's a different fragility, right? Weber says that charisma is a very fragile basis of authority, right? Rational legal's bureaucracy, right? A stronger basis of authority. So that's something interesting to think about.
Yeah. Thank you. Please raise your hands if you have questions. So please, Alexandra, and name yourself.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for the great presentation. My name is Alexandra Flecken. I represent the Higher School of Economics. So the presentation was really fascinating for me, and I just started, to point out some questions I'm not gonna ask, and there was a whole bunch, a whole list of them. So, that is all very interesting, starting off from the legal issue, because, well, that is assassination for sure, and that is illegal. And other things like ideology, well, Al-Qaeda's leader issued his own fatwas, and, well, we could argue if that was partially his kind of ideology, unique for that, in that case, in that time. But the comment I'm going to give, or the question I'm going to ask, is about, well, the last one, and probably the most important one, about the counterterrorism policy implications. So we surely have a huge pool of literature from the Holland School, English School, well, with all the measures, to introduce the preventive, the managerial, and all of them. And, they do work, and they are all implemented. The exit strategy worked brilliantly in Algeria, or, a structural one with the increasing of the social and economic level in Morocco. Yes, But we here are not talking about these countries, are we? Well, you showed us the chronology of the targeted killings and everything. It actually all did really start in about 2002 after the AUMF Act issue. So I guess we're talking about the US policy. And here, the thing that matters is that, well, if we are looking forward to the effectiveness, we need to lose all the other stuff we do. I mean, Ruslan gave a brilliant example of Iraq, but that is actually what's happening everywhere, and it is used as an expansion measure. And as long as it's done so, we cannot speak of effective counterterrorism while fighting in another part of the world. So yeah, that would be my comment, and probably you could answer to this.
So I'm just trying to understand your question. So,
Yeah.
oh, sorry. So just to see if I understand your question, so sort of thinking about the kind of specific context of each different kind of struggle in some way, right? That there's something unique happening in North Africa, or something different happening in Iraq, right? And that drawing generalizations across these, perhaps? Or
I'd probably say that there must be, well, there might be drawn a line between the countries that have the imminent threat of terrorist, from terrorist organizations, like it was in Algeria. Well, for me, it's a brilliant example, or Nigeria today.
Yeah.
And the US, that, well, of course, it kind of uses the agenda, and we've talked about the, well, public opinion over the targeted killings and everything.
Yeah.
But is the effectiveness the key factor defining the counterterrorism policy then?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I would say, I mean, I don't think that this is a cynical answer, but I think you're right. I think your intuition is right, is that the efficacy question isn't always driving it, right? I think there's lots of other motivations for it. I mean, I don't think that, I could be wrong, right? I mean, I'm just like an academic working on this, right? I'm not like working in government or anything like that, but I don't think that people are thinking, oh, well, this is going to have this particular effect, and but you bring up a really interesting point about the authorization of the use of military force, right? And that did broaden the ability of the U.S. to target after 9/11. Right?
And then we talk about the huge drone industry and everything.
Exactly, right? Like that was the way in which, the drones, the sort of use of, of unmanned aerial vehicles were really, you saw a huge increase, right? And that disentangling of the war on Iraq, intertangling of the war on Iraq, the broader war on terrorism, right, and the justification for doing so. Now, that said, I would hope that our policymakers, right, not just here, like anywhere, right, like Israel, Russia, U.S., right, Nigeria, right, Somalia, right, actually think, well, are our policies going to have an intended effect of at least weakening the organization in some way, right? And I think that is the hopes, right? Is that, like, groups have capabilities, and a leader is a capability. And so if you're taking out the leader, you're trying to weaken a group's capabilities. That said, I also think people are motivated by this revenge function, right? I think that's part of it. And so, perhaps that issue of efficacy, or even thinking about, well, maybe it's not right in this case, but maybe it is in this case. So you give the example of, looking at different regions, right? Maybe what's more effective in one region isn't going to be more effective in another. And in fact, the data set includes cases from 1970 on. So it's not just post 9/11 context of, these cases that were taking place, within the context of the AUMF. I mean, I've got cases against, leaders in France in the 1970s and 60s, and Italy, and, the North Caucasus in 2006, and in, Sri Lanka in, the 80s and 90s. So it is broad. It does kind of get that, but that's the part of the limitations, is these big statistical analysis. You lose a lot of nuance, and that's where the cases come in. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Yes.
I hope I answered your question. It's a big question.
We'll have another one.
All right.
Hi, my name is Anna Livia. I'm here in the back. Hi. I have actually just two brief questions. One is, it goes back a little to Soleimani. I was just wondering if the targeting of Soleimani was a spillover of this policy that was targeted to terrorist groups to state policy. If that has anything to do with the fact that we have a CIA officer in the State Department, some kind of spillover of, do you understand what I mean? Like,
Yeah, like state sponsorship, perhaps?
yes, or a strategy that was used to target terrorist groups that maybe now it's going to be used in the state-to-state relationship, you know? If we're going to see this in U.S. diplomacy, and if we were supposed to expect more targetings like that in the future. And the second one, like from your presentation, we really understood which are the organizations that are resilient to this kind of policies, but which ones aren't? Which were the organizations that really got hit by decapitation? Thank you very much.
Let me just, for having a clear picture, remember all of us that in Iran, actually they designated not only the organization of, they designated Pentagon as a terrorist organization, as far as I remember. So that is also interesting to follow the logic of other states.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
practically, so yeah.
Definitely.
Just come on.
So as far as the state to state, I mean, I don't know, right? All I can do is speculate, and I don't feel confident, I think, saying either way whether we're likely to see an increase in, targeting, the leaders or individuals within other states like that, right? So I don't feel confident saying that. That said, within the context of state sponsorship, then it's a little bit different, right? Because, that's often used as a justification, right? Well, you've got these states and they're sponsoring terrorism. I mean, that was part of it, right? It was that, Soleimani, that was part of the justification, was that Soleimani was, in addition to, the argument that he was planning these, attacks on U.S. embassies, but that he was leading all of these, like, Shia militia, these, sort of proxy militia organizations. Oh, sorry, I'm not on it. Okay, is it on? That's on. Okay, all of these, proxy militia organizations, right, in Yemen and in Syria and in Lebanon, and so that was, I think, a unique situation than, like, a head of state, for instance. And that brings up questions of what's that going to mean actually for the future of those particular militia groups, right? Some people argue that Soleimani kind of kept things in check and kind of kept things a little bit under control, and that now that he's gone, these groups are going to operate more independently and increase their activities. Who knows, right? It's sort of too soon to tell. So I guess in short, I don't really know. I don't know. It's a hard question. Which ones were hurt? Yeah. So a lot of the so smaller groups, right? Groups in the early years of a group's forming, right? Those are the organizations that are often, sort of weakened or destabilized. For instance, there was a really well-known example was the Baader-Meinhof gang. They were an organization in Germany, and their whole leadership, was basically put in prison. And the organization, although, actually, it's funny, even that case kind of isn't so clear-cut, because many of the remaining members then kind of started or were active in the Red Army faction. But it was those kinds of organizations, right? These kind of smaller left-wing organizations that often more modeled themselves structurally like sort of military organizations. Those are organizations that tend to be sort of more weakened. But it's really, once you get an organization, once you let an organization pass like a 20-year timeline, it's very hard to destabilize them. So it's sort of early in the year, or early in its life, left-wing, right-wing organizations, right? These are the groups that tend to be much easier to weaken. Yeah.
Please, if there are other questions. I would like to also mention one thing. It's interesting that Soleimani is mostly considered in the region as the most effective guy who defeated ISIS, actually. And then we have American decision to kill them. That is something which is also strange. Like, he was in charge of counterterrorism in the region mostly, in defeating the terrorist organizations, while for some time when it was needed for all of us, he was doing his work and nobody considered do nothing with him. But then, after ISIS defeated, Americans decided to go for this radical decision. Anyway, it's about yeah, it's interesting. I can give you more interesting points about, but I won't. Yeah, please. Yeah, there's a question. Alexander. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Alexander Pivovarenko. I'm from Institute of Slavonic Studies, Russian Academy of Sciences. You mentioned, as far as I understood, three elements that constitute a kind of productive terrorist group, like bureaucracy, criminal support, and ideology. But let me add maybe the fourth element, which might be of great importance, is material support. Like where these groups get money or resources to buy weapons or components. Two questions, if I may, regarding this. First one, is this correct that with the development of internet technologies, these terrorist groups tend to use more sophisticated methods to gain resources, like Bitcoin hacking, or dubious transactions or something, or they still stick to more traditional methods like exaction of tribute from civilians or something else? Second question is, does decapitation have a positive or negative impact on material support of the terrorist groups, or at their ability to generate resources using one or another way? Thank you so much.
Okay. Those are excellent questions. So, what? I turned it. I'm sorry. There's no light.
There is. No? It's fine.
Is it on now? No, it's not.
Yes.
Now it's on. Sorry, guys. Clearly, I'm not really sophisticated with technology, unlike terrorist organizations. Okay, material support is an excellent question. That was something I wanted to look at. I wanted to actually be able to measure sort of group strength in some way, right? Which is one factor. One important factor is getting at that, access to resources, material strength. It was a really hard thing to come up with. So there are actually some people that have said, okay, we're going to use, create, a database that measures material strength for lots of different organizations. Part of the challenge is that in the data set, I've got, hundreds of organizations. And so coding for all of these is a challenge. But that said, even conceptually, I started to think about, well, what are the ways that you'd measure group strength, right? Financing is really hard to get at, right? It's really hard to get a sense of like streams of financing. I mean, we know that ISIS, right, at some point, we know sort of how much money they had, where they were getting it from, right? Extortion, oil fields, robbing and looting, right? Things like that. And we were able to see changes in that over time. But for many of the organizations, it's really difficult to measure that. So then I thought, okay, well, maybe you could, get at this sort of like idea of, access to natural resources or resources in some way. You could think about many of the like insurgent organizations in Africa, for instance. That might be a way to get at that. But that would only hit a couple, So that was something I really struggled with. So if people have ideas on how to measure group strength, I'm all ears, because that's really a challenge. People who've tried to do it have looked at size and strength, or size and age, right, as proxies for strength. But I can't do that because those are my, two sort of main independent variables already in the study. So that's a struggle. Okay, so I'm going to actually then answer your last question first because it's directly related, which is whether or not decapitation has a negative or positive effect on a group's material strength, right? Or their ability to kind of get resources? That is an awesome question. And actually, no one's ever asked me that before. Surprisingly, right? It's really a great question. And I mean, I have not found that it seems to have much of an impact on a group's ability. If anything, I would say that it might give group access to more resources in certain cases, and this goes back to that idea of, you know, kind of sympathy for a cause, or that, calls for retaliation, right? So maybe you might see diaspora communities, right, giving more money, or, people in the local communities joining more, or it would be really interesting to see, and I don't know how to do this because as you have seen, I'm not very technologically savvy, but to see if there's changes in, online activity, in different chat rooms over time, right? Maybe that's one kind of indication of like increasing support, like looking at that shift over time. That might be a really interesting way to get at it. So at an anecdotal level, I haven't seen it, but looking rigorously, we might see something different. I'm not sure, but it would depend on the measure. You'd have to be really, really precise about what you'd look at. Okay. So now thinking about our groups, so your question right before that was, are groups primarily using kind of more technically sophisticated?
Yeah, just simply saying Bitcoin or just getting money from civilians like in cash.
Yeah, Bitcoin. I do not know if, I'm sure that groups are using Bitcoin, right? Like I'd be really surprised if they weren't on, in that financial, using that like as a tool to kind of hide finances in some way. I'd be shocked if they weren't. But at least the organizations that we see active now, the use of internet as a tool of communication is not likely to go away. And it's really a shift because before, right, there was a concerted effort on the part of organizations to have as little communication that could be traced as possible, and that's certainly true in the case of leaders, right? We're not seeing like, Baghdadi wasn't like, online chatting, right? Or anything like that, right? Bin Laden was hiding in a cave, kind of, at least for some period of time, right? Until the end, sort of checked out from communication. And this actually brings up a really interesting idea in the field of network analysis. So I have used network analysis in some other research that I've done, not for this particular case, although I do look to theories in network analysis to understand and some of the theoretical arguments that I make regarding group structure. But it is interesting because what that allows you to do is to map communication, right? And how communication is happening and who's talking to who. So a really basic example of this is, I can't remember the name of the author right now. I'm going to blame the jet lag on this one, but it was right after 9/11. Someone did a mapping of all the different individuals that were flying the plane, that were on the planes, the hijackers after 9/11, and looking at who was talking to who and who was kind of like the most influential person in that. And it was actually kind of counterintuitive what you saw. And so they went through and they looked at different measures of centrality. Right, so there's different measures in network analysis of centrality. So like how many ties you have, how frequently you talk to someone, your closeness score, right? Like how close you are to the center of the network. And it's not always like the person in the position of leadership that is the most central actor in a network, but it's all about understanding how they communicate. And I think you're right. Like now in a increasingly technological world, how that communication is happening is changing. And harder to detect in a lot of ways, right? Because these encrypted platforms, once you get someone's in there, you just find a new platform, right? And if you're not on to find out where the platforms move to, you're out, right? You're not going to be in that next new chat. So it is interesting. It's great questions. Thank you. Really great questions.
Let us take maybe one last question. And
I'm sorry, my answers are going too long. I'll keep them brief.
No, that's okay. Yeah, please.
Раз. Hello, I'm Ivan Bocharov, referent at the RIAC, and I have a very small question. Tell me, please, officials and media announced several times, and they gave some proofs about that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of Islamic State, was killed, but he wasn't. So what do you think? Is it possible that he is alive now?
Okay, I'll be really brief on this one. No, I do not think he's still alive. Because you're right, there were lots of calls that he had been killed before, but I think this one is for sure. Yeah.
Yep.
Particularly because they've now announced the new leader, and they were now. You could go with this theory because initially we didn't know exactly who it was, right? They had a kind of nom de guerre, and we weren't exactly sure who it was. But now we know. So yeah.
Some of my friends say that doesn't matter if he alive or not, for different reasons. But anyway,
Yeah.
And even about decapitation of ISIS, it's interesting that it happened only after ISIS was defeated in the territory.
Yeah.
So that is the weakest point maybe of ISIS ideology. They needed to, they had this point of baqiya wa tatamaddud, means the Islamic State will stay and broaden.
Yeah.
But in the end of the day, they didn't stay, and moreover, they were defeated and lost. It doesn't mean that there will not be new conditions for them to rise. Anyway, thank you very much for this presentation. I think we discussed a number of issues, and this topic will continue to be important and significant in what we are doing. We do it in RIAC as well, and also I hope that we will have future cooperation, and it will be fruitful on this topic as well, but we could find other ways. It was Jenna Jordan with us today, and I hope that those who are here with us and those who are on the internet find something new for them today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for all of the excellent questions. Every time I present, I get new ideas for future research, and there's always